Okay. So before we get started, I want to really emphasize, I cannot stress this enough. This is meant to be a conversation. I don't do well when it looks like I'm just talking to myself. And so I really invite everyone to kind of walk through this research with me and take in what is being shared, not just by myself, but by others. And feel free to share your own. Everyone's thoughts and comments are valuable. Again, this research wouldn't exist if it weren't for most of you, if not all of you, right? And so it's really important that we use this space as a space of dialogue and of conversation, especially in a constructive and productive manner. So again, this is a conversation. I would really like to not just talk to my computer, if that's okay. And then I also want to emphasize that respect is expected. Respect is expected for everybody. I try every minute of the day to be respectful towards everybody that I encounter. And I especially try to be respectful when dealing or when having conversations around things that can be a bit sensitive. And I recognize that this conversation might be a little sensitive. And so it's important that we are all speaking through empathy and through respect and through an understanding that we all share the same goals, right? We all share the same goals and the same visions. So please also use the hand raise feature to indicate that you would like to comment. I cannot really see the Google Meet panel itself. So if there is a hand raised and I don't get to it, someone can feel free to let me know there's a hand raised, but I'll check in periodically. I also have Miss Dawn Monroe, who is here, who is going to be helping me with keeping tabs on the chat. So if you don't feel comfortable verbally responding or verbally adding your comments and such, you can do so in the chat. There may be comments with which you may disagree or agree with, and that is okay. It's a world where everyone agrees on everything is no fun. Again, it's just a matter of being respectful. If there is any discomfort that comes up during this presentation, whether it is because of something I said or because of something that is on the presentation itself, or because it's something someone said, discomfort is okay. Sometimes we have to face discomfort in order to really understand where that discomfort is coming from. So I really invite you all to sit with the discomfort, really understand its roots and its place within this context, and share it with us, right? If it makes you uncomfortable, I think if it's making you uncomfortable, chances are it might be making someone else uncomfortable. And in order for us to move forward, right, we need to understand and really dissect that discomfort. This presentation does not whatsoever cover the entirety of the research project or its findings. As I have said, this is one of many, one of a few. So there will be more research updates down the road. This is not meant to be the final research update, period. So what you all will be seeing as far as my preliminary findings, preliminary suggestions, that's exactly what they are. They're preliminary, meaning that they are not the final. Although they will be part of the final, they are not the final. So there are going to be things that I have as part of my research project. Again, 3 years is a long time, right? So there are other aspects of the research project that I might not be discussing today. If a question gets brought up that does touch on any of the aspects that are not explicitly talked about today, absolutely. I am the type of person where if you ask a direct question, I will give you a direct answer. So if there are any of those questions that do come up, I can absolutely speak on them. But the project is still ongoing as well. So I am still here until September. Even after I go back, unfortunately, go back to the States. I will still be continuing research data collection in various different ways, which you will all be privy to shortly. Finally, I am diagnosed level 1 autistic and ADHD. I have a very strong tendency to be hyperverbal, meaning I talk a lot and I talk really, really fast. So please, please, it will not offend me if someone, says, "Hey, Tylen, do you mind slowing it down a little bit? You're getting a little too excited." Please, I want to make sure that everyone is comfortable and that I'm going at a rhythm that is digestible and palatable for everybody. I also have a dog, and he might bark, he might not. Google Meet has done a good job of background noise cancellation, but just wanted to give you all a heads up in case that happens, which is likely. Before we go ahead and move on, I wanted to see if anyone has any questions. Okay, let's go ahead and move on. And like I said, please don't let me feel like I'm talking to myself. Okay, so the things that we're going to be talking about a little bit today. Oh, yes, Patrick, you have a question?
Yeah, so good day everyone. So I want to know what inspires you to pursue this research dissertation.
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I don't talk about in the project. So I can definitely answer that real quick now. There's a lot of different factors that came into doing the research, not only within autism, mind you, and deafness, right? Because it's both, but also within disability in general and the Caribbean. I myself am of Caribbean descent. I am Cuban and Puerto Rican, proudly, Huepa. And I've always wanted to work within the Caribbean context. I've always wanted to rematriate to the Caribbean. And so this is part of that, right? And then the other aspect is the disability aspect. Me being autistic has really kind of guided me towards really understanding autism through the Caribbean context because of especially my own upbringing. And so that has kind of led me here, while also in a way, because of my professional background as an American Sign Language interpreter, that's my bachelor's is in American Sign Language interpreting. I have done research within deaf studies. That is where the deaf part comes into play. But they both kind of go hand in hand, as you will see soon, within the realm of communication, right? Because we think deafness and autism very wildly different, but there are some parallels, and a lot of those parallels are around the idea, for one, around the severe medicalization or pathologizing of disabled folks, deaf and autistic, but also around communication. And so that kind of gives you a brief overview as to why we are where we are today. Okay, let us get started. So because this is the first of many to come of community updates, I wanted to go ahead and give an overview of the research project. I've talked to a lot of people about the research project and what it all entails, but I wanted to go ahead and give that context, especially because I'm recording and I want to make sure that for the future community updates, people can have the context to look back to if necessary. So we're going to be talking about the study backgrounds, the project aims, so the main research questions, the framework that guides this project, or the lens, if you will, the methods that I am using, and then some of the preliminary findings, some suggestions that I have so far, and what's next. And then a couple of upcoming events as well to share if you are interested. So in a nutshell, this project is intended to understand the everyday experiences of deaf and autistic youth in Barbados. When we talk youth, I use youth vaguely. So the earliest age that I have participated with is 5 years old, 3 years old, 3, 4 years old. And then the oldest when it comes to, again, youth, is 18 to 21. And so very broad, but I kept it that way for a reason, because of how many unknowns there are across that age range. More specifically, it really focuses on communication, learning, and building relationships, not just at school, right? We do have a lot of, I wouldn't say a lot, we do have quite a bit of research in the Caribbean, in Barbados, on autism within the classroom setting. But it's, again, very traditional education research. There might have been a survey, there might have been an interview with teachers, but there's not really a more enriched understanding of the classroom. With that being said, there's even less of an understanding of what their lives and the ways that they navigate and negotiate their lives outside of the classroom looks like, right? So at home and in communities, and with other people, with the dog, with the video games, right? Really understanding their entire livelihood. So putting children at the center and looking at everything that connects to that child. And then it also, because the context is really important and you can't really understand these things of children or of youth out of context, this project also looks at how families, so immediate families, extended families, educators, disability organizations, and governments shape inclusion, access, and belonging. And when I say that, I mean that it really looks at these networks, right? And how each of these not only shape the overall kind of mapping or network or shaping of these children's lives, but also how they either work with or work against each other in tandem, right? Very important. And so that is the background itself. And the questions are very much in line with those. So the main, one of the most important ones, if not the most important, is what are the social, communicative, and learning experiences of deaf and autistic youth in Barbados? The second question, how do community, disability organizations, families, and relevant social actors shape, mediate, and sustain spaces of learning, advocacy, and inclusion for deaf and autistic youth in Barbados? And then the final question that guides this project is, how are disability-related policies, reforms, and everyday policy practices enacted, interpreted, and contested within Barbados's evolving disability policy worlds? One of the reasons why this is so crucial at this moment, if we look back at when I started this project, I started working on this project in, I want to say in September of 2023. In October of 2023, the Ministry of Education rolled out a pamphlet of sorts that was on education transformation and the education reform that they were hoping to roll out. And it got a lot of feedback from parents and organizations and communities, education staff, right? Some okay, so a lot not so great. And so with these conversations came, okay, what about disabled children, especially those who are particularly neurocognitive, have neurocognitive disabilities, or in the case of deafness and autism too, communication-based disabilities. What does education reform look like for them? So it really started, for me, it really started with looking at that pamphlet and immediately noticing some disparities with how general education was spoken on and also how inclusive education was spoken on. I've also already done research within the university setting in the US, but nonetheless within the university setting on policy as written and then policy as practiced. So what does implementation look like? What does enforcement look like? And that project showed a lot of disparities between what was written or not written and what was actually happening. And so I knew it was important and it was absolutely crucial to include conversations and negotiations around policy reforms, especially when looking at the history, right, of disability, or the history of disability policy, if you will, in Barbados. And so all of this comes together, right? All of these things influence and are connected with each other, and ultimately shape and influence the lives of our children and youth. So the framework that I am using to guide this is kind of a patchwork framework. I felt it was necessary, and also in true fashion, the Caribbean, right? It felt really appropriate to use kind of a patchwork framework that really catered to the nuance of the Caribbean. So I am looking at this project through the lens of critical disability studies and disability anthropology, which looks at disability not as just a medical impairment or deficit. It's more through the socio-cultural, the historical, and the political systems, right? So how is disability shaped by society and cultural norms, policy, history, right? Rather than, again, just as an individual deficit. The second one is through decolonial and post-colonial. Decolonial, post-colonial, and Caribbean affirming approaches, meaning, again, it was extremely important for me to make sure that this project was in line with the Caribbean, was aligned with the Caribbean context. A lot of the research that we have that exists in the research ether, if you will, tends to be from the global north, right? UK, Canada, and the US. It was really, really important that this project was rooted within Caribbean histories and Caribbean context, to include trying to curate the methodologies, or trying to ensure that the design of this research is also aligned with Caribbean livelihoods and Caribbean lifestyles. So making sure that the design is not misaligned with the people. And so this project centers Caribbean histories, identities, and ways of knowing, while challenging colonial and Eurocentric ideas about disability, learning, and communication. Colonialism is something, I am of the argument that when we speak on the Caribbean, to speak holistically of the Caribbean is to understand legacies of colonialism and how legacies of colonialism have influenced and shaped us to this day, right? So that is a huge part of this project as well, or at least this project is couched within that idea. And then finally, examining how deaf and autistic youth learn, communicate, and navigate everyday life within families, schools, communities, and disability policies, especially when we are discussing language. So really about understanding language and communication. Very, very hard, right? So it was something that I had to really work a lot around, particularly with the non-speaking autistic population or participants. And so that required a lot of adaptability and a lot of flexibility, which often goes against this really hard, strict idea of what science looks like. But again, it was really important that I was able to involve them. There's really no research done within the realm of non-speaking autistic children and youth within the Caribbean. If there is a very small amount, very, 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 very small amount. Most of it is with autistic people, autistic children, autistic students who can speak, or have some semblance of speech. And then finally, it's not on here, but is woven throughout this framework, is this understanding that children are not just pre-humans, but children are human beings in their own right, human beings who feel, like things, don't like things, make decisions, experience success and failures, trial and error, and do have some semblance of autonomy and agency over their lives, while also understanding that a lot of the agency and autonomy in their lives are kept away from them, whether through, again, historical connotations of colonialism and or within the realm of disability and how we view disabled youth. So some of the methods, by some I mean all, these are all the methods. I'm a glutton for punishment. Yes, so these are the methods that I used as part of this project. I used observations. So some of those observations looked like participant observations, meaning that I was in a space as a participant. I was also engaged in that space. Some of the observations were more shadow or non-participant observations where I kind of just sat back and observed, didn't really participate too much. I also engaged in arts and activities-based methods, as you can see in the picture on the right. Those were all pictures done by a cohort of autistic children that I worked with during a camp that I hosted specifically for this project. Some of the arts and activities-based methods are within group settings, and then some of them are also within one-on-one sessions. So there are times where I was with groups, and there were times where I had regularly occurring or one-time sessions with children or with youth. So then there's also the interactions and engagement. I also included field trips as part of this project. I recognize that coming into this project, I recognized that there are not a lot of opportunities afforded to autistic children or just children with disabilities in general to do things recreationally and educationally outside of the home and outside of school. That's not to say all kids, but that was a huge dilemma that I kind of had to deal with, because I needed to also be able to observe and interact with children outside of the home, right? And so I ended up hosting some field trips, still doing that, but I did some outings and whatnot, and I would take some kids to different events that maybe they otherwise wouldn't have been able to go to, whether because of transportation or, conflicts. And so that was also part of this project. I also conducted your traditional interviews, and I conducted interviews with a wide range of folks, as we will see shortly. And then the kind of maybe a little bit more boring part, but not so boring for me, parts of the methods are policy practices and analysis, content analysis, and archival analysis. And what that basically means is that I go through the policies. I have gone through and I'm still going through the laws, the policies in Barbados that are enacted, like the the Rights for Persons with Disabilities Act that was passed in January 15th, 2025. I'm also currently looking at the final draft of the Inclusion Education Policy, in addition to a few other things like the Social Empowerment Agency policy, a few of the older policies from, for example, like the 1990s with the Green Papers, and such. That also include conversations around government press. So part of that also is, I'm just admitting someone, part of that is also understanding and analyzing parliament sessions, right? Press releases, videos, public outreach, all the things that government officials are doing around this idea of, this concept, broad concept of disability or disability in education, special education, inclusive education. If it's out there, I have it. If it's out there, I have it. So part of that is that policy practice is not necessarily just the policy paper, but also what are people saying, and how does that align with what's actually being done, right? Content analysis, so really understanding also how people are talking about things, whether on social media or through news resources like Barbados Today, Nation News, CBC. Again, if it's out there and it has anything to do with the keywords I had already mentioned, I probably have it. And then finally, archival analysis. It was, again, really important to the holism of this project to understand the histories of disability as transformed in the Caribbean, or well, in the Caribbean, but particularly in Barbados, especially around colonialism and particularly post-emancipation, and around post-emancipation following to, especially around the 1960s, 1990s for the deaf portion, because that's when we see the Florida School for the Deaf and Blind, but also especially for autism within the last, I would say the last 2 or so decades, right? Understanding the transformations, what has transformed and what has not transformed, what has been worked on, what has not been worked on. All of those things are really important, right? For the credibility of what is being said, especially as of today, what is being said out by government officials and what's being done, and so on and so forth. So the data that I've generated so far, as you can see, lots of hours. So I've had a total, this is a rough total, but I've had a total of 382 observational hours so far. I have a total of 153 hours of sessions, again, whether in group or individual sessions, to a total 535. I suspect that the number is really closer to like 560. By the time I leave in September, it will be closer to 650. You can hold me accountable to that. We'll see in the next meeting, the next community update. For interviews, I have interviewed 15 parents, most of them being parents of children with autism, 7 education staff, most of them being education staff that works with autistic children, 5 support professionals, and then 2 autistic adults, 2 deaf adults, for a total of 31 interviews. And each interview, mind you, each interview was about, I think the shortest interview was about 45 minutes, and then the longest interview was probably about 2 hours, 2.5 hours. On average, they stayed around the 1.5 hour mark. The data that I have not yet quantified, and so therefore cannot really give you right now, are the data around observations in government spaces and activities. So again, the policy practices, policy practice analysis, content analysis, and archival materials. I suspect that those, again, because I'm looking through so many decades, I suspect that those will also be in the 3-figure marks of hours. But again, community update number 2 should have better numbers for everybody. So before we get to the preliminary findings, I just wanted to see if anyone had any questions so far on just the research design itself, especially. I also wanted to make sure that there's no confusion. It's important for everyone to have clarity around the presentation in general, but especially the research project. So I just wanted to see if anyone had any questions. I wanted to make time for some questions or comments. Feedback is also really important and is one of the reasons why I wanted to hold this. Michelle, go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon. Are you hearing me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, hi everyone. I just wanted to ask about your literature review. I know you said that there is basically a scarcity of literature in the Caribbean. You mentioned that you have accessed some policies, documents from Barbados over the years, but have you been able to use any of the peer-reviewed research done in the Caribbean in your study, or has it been from other territories?
That's a great question. I will definitely have a more specific list for you in the next community update. But the research that so when first doing the literature review, my literature review of 300 resources, 300 citations, a lot of the research within the Caribbean, there are some that has been done in Barbados, particularly by the scholar Stacy Blackman, I believe is her name, Professor, or Dr. Stacy Blackman, Professor Stacy Blackman, correct me if I'm wrong. She's done the brunt of special education research. There's also Gary Hornby, who's done some of the special education research here, albeit a while ago. In addition to a few other names. Some of the other islands or countries within the Caribbean region that are part of the literature review are Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, Haiti, Antigua, and Puerto Rico. There's probably a few more in there. There is a few more in there, but off the top of my head, those are some of the peer review, like you said, peer reviewed, right? Those are some of the articles that are part of the literature review that I have currently.
Okay, thank you. And my last question has to do with the policy documents that you have reviewed from Barbados. Where did you get access to those? Did you have to go through some authorization from the government, or are they publicly available?
Straight from the horse's mouth. Okay, so the Barbados government website has both the social empowerment. Okay, so they have, of course, right, the Social Empowerment Agency bill. They have the bill for rights for persons with disabilities act on there. They also have the Child Protections Act that was recently amended, I believe, to include disabilities, like children with disabilities. That's on my list of things that I need to also dissect. And then there's also the Constitution that I believe was recently amended or is meant to be amended to include disabilities. The policy, I would have to get back to you on the inclusive education policy final draft. I will say it was not easy finding that one. I had to go to all ends of the Google Earth to really find that one. I believe it was still through the government, but I would have to double check. But if anybody is interested in the inclusive education policy final draft, please feel free to send me an email. My email will be at the end of will be on the slide at the end of the presentation. And I'm more than welcome to share that with you. Also, I'm more than welcome to share any of the resources that I have. I recognize that especially within more of the nation state related documents, those things are really hard to find. Intentionally so, unintentionally so, you get to decide if you want to have a tinfoil hat on or not. But if there's anything that you ever need that I might have or can find, I'm a very good sleuther. I am definitely a master PI. And so I tend to find things one way or another. So yeah, so hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Of course. Did anyone else have any other questions before we move on? Okay, let's keep going. Okay, also, actually, wait, sorry, I'm gonna back it up again. I just want to, I'm gonna go ahead and preface this with, this is the part where we might get a little uncomfortable. Here is where some of the discomfort is gonna probably come through. I just want to really emphasize that this project is not of my own through the US. I am not necessarily saying these things, right, as fact. This project, I 100% made sure 3.5 years ago, still to this day, and will continue to do so, that this project was done through community by community, for community, with community in mind, right? So it was extremely important for me to have multiple points of collaboration to make sure that all parents, all families felt like they can be engaged with this project. Again, if there are direct questions, I will have direct answers. I am not one to kind of beat around the bush. I am not one to give you a non-answer answer. With that being said, I am also not a traditional neutral researcher, right? So for one, I'm of the argument that there's no such thing as neutrality when it comes to research, but especially when it comes to research within vulnerable populations, full stop, period. So it's also important to keep that in mind as we dive into the next few slides. I am not a neutral researcher. I am very much aligned with the goals of equity and justice for disabled communities, especially within the Caribbean context. If anyone has any questions on that, please let me know after we're through with the slides. Okay, so some of the preliminary findings that I have to share so far, I have more, but we're gonna do just these for now, are communication misalignments, intervention contentions, mainstream to void pipeline, autistic children become autistic invisible, and then the conflict between autism and Barbadian culture, but Barbadian education culture as well. And we're gonna dissect these. This is really where if I wanted y'all to engage at any point of this presentation, is gonna be now. So please, please, please feel free to share and feel free to ask questions, right? And yeah, just feel free to make this space your own, feel comfortable, but be respectful, right? Okay. So with communication misalignments, autistic youth understand more than society thinks. I say that because often there is this preconceived notion that because they do not have communication or they don't have full communication, they must not understand what is going on in the world around them. That is not true. That is not the case. And that has been shown time and time again in this project, in this research. Where the contentions lie are with how we understand communication. Because we deem communication as a very specific set of rules, anyone that does not adhere to those rules must not actually understand not only what I'm saying, but what's going on around them. And that is very, very misaligned with what is actually happening. So when people, and when I say people, I include parents and teachers, education staff, the grocery staff, the person down the road, the one selling coconut water, like everybody. It is important to understand that what you say and do in front of them, they are taking it in. If you laugh at them, if you say things that are negative, all of these things are being soaked in, whether it looks like it is or not, right? So that's a huge part of what has been kind of happening within this terrain around non-speaking autistic children, youth, young adults, adults in general, is this misconception that they don't actually understand what's going on. And so then people feel free to do anything and everything, say anything and everything in front of them. And that can have some really serious repercussions around sense of belonging, right? Well-being, and just a sense of, identity and confidence. Behavior and the corporeal are used to communicate. So just in line, as I said, with the strict set of rules that society deems are appropriate for communication, autism says no, right? It's not necessarily speech. Even for those who are speaking autistic folks, right? Speaking autistic children. Speech is not the end all be all. And it is very clear within autism, meaning that behavior and the body are communication tools. It is extremely important that we understand that and we come to grips with that. And I say that because when you have non-speaking, especially non-speaking autistic youth who are behaving in certain ways, especially deemed unappropriate or inappropriate by society, it's not about deterring behavior at this point, it's about deterring communication. They will communicate in whatever ways they know how, which then leads me to my next point. Independence, very much centered, right? A lot of parents, a lot of staff, community organizers have talked about independence. You know, how can we get them to be independent? We need to work towards getting them independent. You know, what's going to happen to my kids when they become adults? They need to be independent. But one aspect of this independence is communication. And communication is not given the same urgency as, say, cooking. So we really need to start leaning more towards this idea of affirming communication. When I say affirming communication, I say that the situation right now with parents and families. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. So the situation is that I just for the first time am supposed to meet, haven't met her yet, but just for the first time learned of a child a teenager who uses an AAC device. And I don't just mean like PECs, I mean like a true AAC device, uses it to convey and express abstract thought and voicing complex expressions and so on and so forth. One of the issues that has been apparent within conversations around communication has been this idea of, well, if I teach the child to communicate in that way, no one is going to really understand that, right? Which then places the responsibility of what is reciprocal communication largely on the autistic person. So either they can have communication and maybe they can only communicate with a network of people, or they just don't communicate at all. And I think that those two extremes are not quite aligned with what we can truly serve our non-speaking autistic folks with, which are a variety of communication approaches. Autistic people already use different communication styles, right? Some of them are reprimanded and some of them are praised, again, with speech and whatnot. But what is important is that they have access to whatever communication they are comfortable with, right? Communication goes both ways. And for the responsibility, for the onus to be only on the autistic person is unjust. It's not necessarily fair. It creates a disadvantage with that person. So, of course, interventions, what is autistic research in Barbados without conversations around interventions? There has not been really any urgency for government-led, expanded quality, accessible early intervention supports. The same testimonials from parents who have dealt with long wait lines and very, 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 very few access to resources 5, 10, 15 years ago is the same testimonials from parents who have children who are 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old that are also saying that there are long wait lines, that there are long wait lists, few resources, zero resources, right? And when there are resources, for example, through the state, you're only allotted so many sessions, which is not enough. And then if you go private, even those sessions are still not enough, because as research has stated, as research has shown, these early interventions are crucial, period. But they especially benefit the child, they especially benefit the person when they have it consistently. And a lot of these therapies really, really require more than 1 hour session once a week. But the problem is money, right? Money and resources, money and accessibility around these situations, right? And so far there hasn't really been much of an urgency for government spaces to really, you know, pull themselves up by the bootstraps and really get this very required, very urgent, very critical situation under wraps. And I say that because these are lives, right? We say autistic kids become autistic adults, and then, but we don't really follow through with that, right? There is not really a follow through in quite understanding what it means when a child is not given the support and resources, and what that looks like across the lifespan. Because these developments are not out of context. All of these things influence that child for the rest of their life. Some children live in a socio-educational limbo. There are some autistic children who have been out of school for years. There are truancy laws here, so it is illegal, but nonetheless, here we are. Part of that socio-educational limbo is because they have been thrown out of school. And so there's nowhere for them to go. Part of that socio-educational limbo is because of the lack of resources and the lack of understanding around autism, especially within more formal educational settings. Part of the problem is that the traditional, which we will talk about shortly, the traditional educational classroom setting and structure is, it inherently contradicts, right, autism life ways and autism manifestations. So there are a lot of children, a lot of young adults too, who just kind of exist in this liminal space between what they had and what is next, but there doesn't really seem to be a lot of understanding or a lot of, there's really no infrastructure on the what is next part. And so you find that parents are really just left to their own device, which we will also talk about in one of the next findings. Community care and autism affirming networks are few and far between. When I say community care and autism affirming networks, I mean in-depth networks, really, really specific and nuanced, deep networks of care where there are not only just educational information around autism awareness, but true solidarity and true support around the family and that child. And when I say that, I mean, there have been most, if not all parents have said that one of the biggest issues that they face is this idea of solitude. While yes, there are events that happen a couple times a year and there are digital spaces in which they can kind of engage with, there's not really a lot of consistent support systems or care communally afforded to families, let alone the child themselves, or especially the young adult themselves, which we will also be discussing more shortly. And then, as I've mentioned, there is minimal to no support for youth and adults who have missed out on early intervention. So I've worked with families who have young adult children or children in their teens, right, who did not get the early intervention that they deserved and absolutely had a right to. And so now they're dealing with a lot of situations around, again, this socioeducational limbo, not sure where to put them, not sure what to do, parent burnout, right? All of these situations, and there's really nothing that can be done at this moment, right? There's nowhere for the parents, there's nowhere for the family to turn to when it comes to this disparity. So we have a situation where early intervention is crucial, but if you do not have the proper connections / financial and human support, you may or may not get to a point where now you have a child who has raging hormones, right, and is not equipped to deal with both the manifestations of autism and, you know, those hormonal imbalances or just development, right, in general. The mainstream to void pipeline, I actually, in the next community update, I will have a graphic for this. I have, for some who have seen it, I have, for those who have not, I have a drawing that I created because I'm very visual. I had a drawing that I created and I have been showing it to different people just to get feedback. So that will be the next community, that will be in the next community update. But one of the things that I've observed is that children, and I say disabled children in this specific case, but children in general go through very specific, almost quality assurance checkpoints. And if those quality assurance checkpoints deem that child to be abnormal, then they are thrown into, again, a liminal or limbo space where then the parents, the family has to figure it out and just move forward from there.
Oh yeah. Oh, you didn't know gap. I see.
I ain't write them myself. I ain't say Vincent.
Oh, okay.
So these quality assurance points are very like intentionally placed. So you have your quality assurance checkpoint number 1. Well, you have quality assurance checkpoint 0, which is when the baby is born. There are certain disabilities that usually can be identified, like Down syndrome and such. Then there's quality assurance 1 around the 3 to 4 year old age range, which is, you know, specifically around can they self-toilet or not. Part of it is speech, part of it is not. The main part is can they go to the bathroom on their own or not. And then the second quality assurance checkpoint is around the 11 plus. The third quality assurance checkpoint is once they enter into secondary education, because secondary education is truly a different feat compared to primary school education, especially when it comes to neurocognitive disabilities and just the challenges of studenthood. And then it goes on until there. It's a lot more in depth than that, I promise, but that's just to give you an idea. Education staff are expected to carry much of the responsibility for inclusive special education systems. Full stop. What I mean by that is that, as we already know, as many of us already know, you know, in this meeting, there's no regulation, there's no standardization around special education, inclusive education curriculum. So what I have found is that often the schools on their own will get together with their staff and kind of, special education schools, mind you, will get together with their staff and just kind of look at the standard curriculum and be like, all right, what are we gonna add? What are we not gonna, what are we gonna pull from this? How are we, you know, what are we gonna do? What are we gonna do? But curriculum development is a whole nother beast, right? Curriculum development deserves intentionality and it deserves regulation and auditing, right? And evaluation, just as the standard curriculum has gotten. So education staff are essentially left doing multiple jobs, right? Within their one position as a teacher. The following is that government systems often struggle to support disabled children seen as unfit for mainstream schooling. Back to that idea of socioeducational limbo. There have been situations from that parents have experienced, that educators have experienced, where they are given children that the government just doesn't know what to do with. And so now they're stuck not knowing what to do with that child, right? And so that becomes a huge issue, right? Because there are repercussions to that. If you do not, if there is no intentionality with how placement is being practiced with children with disabilities or with just children in general, it can be very detrimental to their academic achievement or academic attainment. And then last for this one is that parents are left to make major educational decisions without adequate support or information. Now, the caveat there, or I should say, let me expand on that to make sure that I'm clear with what I mean by that. What I mean is that parents are left to figure it out on their own. they are left to make very, very serious, very life-shaping decisions around their child's livelihood, their child's education, their child's life, without the support of professionals and without the support of community, right? And so parents are then left with the burden and left with the weight of making extra decisions around their child's education that will absolutely shape the rest of their lives, right? And they're doing that without the nuanced education or information, right, that would be given to them had they actually had all of the resources, right? So it's like making a decision without knowing the full context. And unfortunately, parents are being left to their own devices, if you will. Autistic children become autistic invisible. As you would have noticed, I've only interviewed 2 autistic adults. That was not intentional. I am still looking to interview autistic adults. They are hard to find, apparently, and they're hard to access. And that is because most of them, there's nowhere for them to go. There are no formal or informal supports for autistic young adults. So oftentimes I've heard parents of autistic adults saying that, you know, their best friend is their mom, or, you know, the only people they hang out with are their immediate family members because they're just at home, right? And also because there is this kind of conception around autistic adults being regressed and autistic adults being developmentally delayed, they end up being looked at within the same lens as autistic children. So then they're grouped with autistic children, which has its own issues, right, and its own challenges, but it also has its own depravities when it comes to sense of belonging, right? Because autistic adults deserve to have camaraderie and solidarity with autistic adults, but that is not necessarily happening currently, not in a well-rounded, structured, formal or informal kind of way. Again, autistic adults rarely have social or support networks outside of their immediate family. And there's really not many, I wrote not many just to be a little lighthearted, there are no adult-centered opportunities for autistic young adults. So oftentimes parents are then left to taking their autistic adults to more child-dominated events, which again has its own issues. Would love to divulge. If anyone has more questions about that, you know, please feel free. And then I believe this is the last preliminary finding that I have to share, is a lot of manifestations of autism I've seen as kind of counterculture to Barbadian culture, Barbadian education culture, but also just Caribbean culture in general. One of the manifestations of autism is autonomy and agency, right? Hierarchies are non-existent. And if an autistic child does understand hierarchies, they don't understand the point and therefore do not want to follow them. So when we have classrooms and we have spaces that are more authoritarian structured, they're going to push back very often. Explicitly, if it's implicit, they're going to shut down, right? So on the one hand, there might be a child that now is deemed, you know, disruptive or bad behaviored. Or on the other hand, if it's a child that is internalizing these disparities, then it's a child who is too quiet, who is too to themselves, who isn't very communicative or isn't willing to engage, right, with other people. Autonomy and agency is extremely important to autistic people, including autistic children and autistic youth. So there's that contestation, right? And this idea of authoritarianism within even the household or within the classroom setting is a very Caribbean thing. Not only a Caribbean thing, but nonetheless, that is part of Caribbean cultural practices around child rearing and education. There's a heavy emphasis on a specific kind of sociality that is deemed a requirement for full equitable integration, which often leaves autistic youth and adults behind, meaning that if an autistic person cannot pass well enough in social settings, then they're kind of deemed as pariahs, they're deemed as outliers. They're not as engaged or as immersed or integrated within society. And that's because in the Caribbean, we do valorize and cherish socialness, right? We're very community, social type beings. But what comes with that is that there are certain markers that have to be met in a way that is required for like full integration. Is that a solely autistic problem? No. Which again can be another conversation for another time if anyone has questions on that. Autistic communication may be seen as bad behavior, as we've discussed. When I say autistic communication, I mean especially non-speaking autistic people who communicate through their body, who communicate through behavior, through actions, through the materials around them, right? The second a child is labeled as disruptive and has a diagnosis label, it's a wrap, it's over. And then again, authoritarian style classrooms rarely, if ever, work well for autistic students. That's part of the mainstream to void pipeline. As soon as these kids are seen as disruptive, they're automatically ousted from general education opportunities. So some of these are vague right now, but some of the preliminary suggestions that I recommend as a professional within the space, as an expert, but also as someone who has a lived experience, are, for one, just much more in-depth and organized and structured community and government communication interventions. I mean that we should absolutely be affirming whatever communication children desire. If it means that they want to use PECs, great. If it means they want to use sign language, great. If it means that they want to use AAC devices, great. They should be given access to these things. Parents should be given access to trainings and support, and these children should be given access to consistency. Because one of the issues is that those that do have AAC devices or are kind of working on AAC devices or alternative modes of communication, it is not consistent around school and other spaces. So they might be working on it at home, but they're not working on it at school at all, period. And consistency is so crucial towards creating healthy habits for autistic people, but just in general for autistic mental health and just progress in general. Stronger, more integrated community networks, care, there should be a C there, care networks, meaning that it should be more than just a couple of events here and there around a specific time of year. There needs to be a lot more community options and a lot more resources and a lot more social spaces and a lot more support spaces and a lot more of every space, really, of any kind of space imaginable. These things need to exist, and they need to exist in a way that is accessible to everyone, including those who may not have the financial means to pay for things all the time, or those who might have weird work schedules, you know. There needs to be more accountability when it comes to government and educational spaces. And when I say that, I don't necessarily mean only from people outside of the government and outside of educational spaces. I'm also talking about people within government and within educational spaces. They should be holding themselves accountable. They should be holding each other accountable. There is no accountability. There is little to no auditing. There is little to no evaluations, little to no really anything. Regulation, really understanding quality support, right? What does quality teacher training look like? What does quality differential education look like, right? What does quality support look like? These things, people kind of just get to do whatever they want. And for some people it works because they're committed and have the training and maybe do the self-professional development you know, what have you, a slew of factors. And then some people just do whatever they want because no one's stopping them, right? No, you know, there's nothing telling them that they can't. There needs to be concrete spaces and resources for autistic adults. Full stop. I don't know what else to say past that. If you have questions on that, please let me know. But there is such a disservice that's happening within the Caribbean in general, but obviously this is on Barbados, right? So within Barbados for autistic adults. And I don't necessarily mean just like life skills training. I'm talking about the whole nine. When I say we, those who are non-disabled or non-disabled passing, what we have access to as adults, they should also have access to as adults in their own way, right? In the ways that make sense for them as determined by them, right? And then we also, my dog's barking, hopefully y'all can't hear it very well. We also need culturally relevant and informed autism sensitivity. When I say that, I mean that there are plenty of autism sensitivity trainings, autism awareness presentations. I've done them here, right, that are just vague and really neutral or really out of context. But what we really need is to understand autism and understand approaching autism and people with autism within a cultural context. An example of this is a conversation that I had with a parent on this manifestation or trait of autism, not only of autism, but of autism, called pathological demand avoidance, which inherently is a trait of autism that the second it feels like that person is being deprived of their autonomy or agency or deprived of choice, they react in a slew of disruptive ways, right? Or in challenging, you know, they might challenge whatever it is that's being requested of them. They might act out, right? Again, because discipline and fitting the mold is so societally important, these things are important to discuss, not because we want them to, right, have to force themselves to fit into the mold, but because these are the things that we were brought up with, that we understand. And it's important to understand how that affects or how that contradicts the way autism is manifested in a person. And then treat these issues with the urgency they deserve. If I could be forthright and honest, I've seen, I'm a little tired of seeing people in power kiki it up and haha this and haha that and not really taking things seriously. Because if you're willing to laugh in front of an audience and you know, just take it as a joke, then that tells me really a lot of what I need to know about how seriously you're taking it in private. And I don't necessarily just say that within government, I'm saying within all positions of power, to include education settings as well, community organizations, like all of them, right? Everyone besides the child has a position of power. Does that position of power look the same? Absolutely not. But are they positions of power nonetheless? Yes. But with that being said, we really need to be treating these issues with the urgency they deserve. These are whole lives, people who can live very, very long lives, just like everybody else, right? And so it's not that these issues are impactful, these deprivations are impactful for this person only for the first 15 years of their life. It is impacting them for the rest of their lives. So it is important that we really, really, really start lighting some fires under some pants. I don't know. There also needs to be a breakdown of silos. And when I say silos, I mean that there's a lot of stuff that happens in isolation within government. So then there's a lot of things that will overlap that happen as opposed to just working together, but that also happens within community organizations and just within community in general. There would be a lot more done if people just work together, right? I've been saying a lot of, people just need to talk to each other. People just need to talk to each other. Because we're all working towards the same goal. Everyone wants to see the same thing, which is socioeconomic progress, right? Equitable opportunities and spaces for autistic people and people with disabilities. And then last, invest more time and effort into autistic people. Everything that parents deal with extremely important. There is a space for that, but there is not really a space at all for focusing on autistic people themselves, right? So fostering spaces for autistic people to become self-advocates, for them to become organizers, for children and youth to learn self-confidence amongst themselves, right? Those things are really important, as they are important in all of society. We already do these things, all of these things we really already do with the non-disabled children and youth, etc. And we should be providing them with the same affordances. We should be giving them the same opportunities. So what's next for the next community update? I am still looking to conduct more interviews with parents. So if you're a parent and you haven't talked to me yet and you would like to talk to me, I would love to speak to you. I am still doing observations and sessions with children. I am currently organizing all of my policy, archival, and content data. Please pray for me. I plan on holding more community update sessions. And then I am also working with my colleague, Dawn Monroe, and a few others on offering nuanced trainings and education that respond specifically to the needs that have been highlighted in the research, especially from parents and teachers and children, and and so on and so forth. So we do have a couple of upcoming events if you're interested. So I do have a community update on the deaf research part of this project. That's Wednesday, June 24th at 6 p.m. And then I also am hosting a digital literacy training. These will be bi-monthly, I believe. I'm hosting a digital literacy training around disability-related sourcing. One of the things that I found with a lot of parents is that when I ask where they get their information from, they quite literally say Google. So I figured maybe it would be a good opportunity to provide parents, caregivers, educational staff, the works, with training around understanding what information is credible, peer-reviewed, reputable, and what information might be misinformation and deserves a little bit more skepticism. So that'll be Thursday, July 9th, 2026. Again, 2026, 5 p.m. AST. Again, those will be held bi-monthly, so if you can't go to that one, hopefully the next one. And then that's all I have. Thank you for sticking with me until 6:28 p.m. I really appreciate it. I figured this would probably be about an hour and a half. I am a certified yapper. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to let me know. Yes, Traveen.
Hi.
Hi.
So it's not a question per se, but
Yeah.
I was really intrigued with this topic because I am from Trinidad, right? And I've worked with children with autism, and I was very interested to see how the policies here in Barbados, if they differ from Trinidad. And what you're saying is actually true, because it's the same around the Caribbean, because everybody has this particular mindset or this block, I would like to say. Maybe we don't have the appropriate access to information, but that's why I really appreciate what you did here, because it also allowed us, even though it's a small community that you started with, this could now branch off into something much bigger. So I'm very, very thankful that I was a part of this. Thank you so much for doing this. But yeah, it's just very interesting to see that throughout the Caribbean, this is a common issue that we have. And this doesn't only go for children with autism, but disability on a whole, because I think a lot of, especially in Trinidad, a disability is more like a taboo. We are afraid to say that my child is developing a little bit slower than the others, and how do we move forward? But I didn't know that in Barbados. I thought Barbados had a little more, they were a little more faster with probably diagnosing the children, early diagnoses. The education system might be a little more developed, but it's the same happening in Trinidad as well. So you opened my eyes to a lot of things here, so I'm very thankful for that.
Yeah, and just so a couple of things. When it comes to diagnosis and assessments have gotten better in Barbados within the last, I want to say, 5 to 10 years. Those have gotten better. It's the, okay, what's next part that has not really gotten better. And then the lack of information and lack of resources. So as soon as a parent receives the diagnosis or the assessment, for one, they aren't given an understanding of the assessment itself. And then for two, they're just kind of like rushed out the door and then see you later, hopefully not kind of situation. But nonetheless, diagnostics, those kinds of things are increasing. We are seeing a lot more resources for diagnoses. There are still issues. I have met a lot of parents who suspect their child of having autism, and they don't have the resources financially. Most people have to do have to get private assessments. So that is still something that is, you know, needing to be worked on, but at the very least there has been progress on that. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that I am not doing it right now because I'm only one human being, but one of the things that I'm really interested in doing for the larger Caribbean, especially through Caged Bird Rise, which is meant to be a Caribbean disability justice network, is just what you said, really understanding what is going on with policy development and policy practices around the Caribbean region. So I'm going to be working on that very soon to include Trinidad and Tobago. I have some scholar colleagues that are based in Trinidad that I'm hoping to partner with. But nonetheless, I am really wanting to do something where I would really like to do something where we have a better understanding to do more kind of comparative research around policy development and disability in the Caribbean. So thank you for bringing that up. I appreciate it. And then Frank. Hi, Frank.
Hi, good evening. Good evening, everybody. You've covered quite a huge amount of material today, so it's in one way it's quite difficult to pick and choose those things which are the most important. But you've just said one thing which I would disagree with before I come on to something else. The reference to what you said a few moments ago about diagnosis being better in the last 5 to 10 years. I wouldn't agree with that at all. The kind of parents who can afford private diagnosis services, maybe it has got better for them. But the vast majority of people out there in Barbados are in a socio-economic group which can't afford private diagnosis. And these are the guys who I get telephone calls from at least once or twice a week asking me, what do I do? The only thing I can tell them is to, first of all, check in officially with the Children's Development Center, which is just down the road from me. And of course, they do that. Then they call me back and say, well, we've been told that the waiting list for our particular group can be up to 12 months. Now, for them, for those parents, that's a damning thing to receive.
Absolutely.
And it makes them extremely depressed on the parents and caregiver side. So I would say that is not correct to make a broad statement like that. It's okay for some. It's certainly not okay for the vast majority of people. I did a study of the Children's Development Center along with a few other people in what I call the COVID and just post-COVID years, and we concluded that there's a lot of very good people there, but their numbers have not been invested in properly to keep the numbers up. The CDC started off about 30 or 35 years ago, and at that time there was very few offerings for children with problems, and at that time as well they could probably cover the pitch at both ends and satisfy most people who came through the door. But right now, with maybe a generation and a half later, you will find that they are still treating people that they met 35 years ago who have now grown into adults. So what they actually are doing, they're covering a whole group of people who have now grown up to be autistic people or other people with all sorts of difficulties, and as well as new people. So they are carrying a doubled up weight of work, and they are extremely overworked, and they cannot meet the demand. So that's what I was saying about that. The other thing you said at the very beginning was that you used the phrase autonomy is kept away from young adults who are on the spectrum. I wouldn't say that that was entirely true. It's a broad statement, and I think you've got to go into the nuances of this. I think that most parents, caregivers with autistic adults, they want them to be autonomous. They're quite willing to let them have as much power as possible. But the problem is that the people that they would normally associate with to learn things from are what I call ordinary how do we say it? Ordinary experienced people, people who are just regular adults of the same age. And the problem is they may have the patience to take them out on social occasions every now and again. But when it comes down to taking them out on a frequent, regular basis, they're not interested. So you actually get your child looking forward to going out with another friend who's a mate, if you like, going to a pool station, or going to have a dinner somewhere, going for a fast food, going in somebody else's car for once, for God's sake. That's a different experience for them. You may find that this goes on now and again, and then it becomes very infrequent, because those other regular adults just get fed up with the situation. They haven't got the patience, they haven't got the education, they want to get on with their own lives, and they tend to think of it as a chore. They start off thinking of it, this could be fun, this is okay, I will take this guy out, I will feel good about it, they will feel good about it, everybody's happy. But after about the third or fourth time, they don't want to know. And in fact, you are reduced, as the parent, you are reduced to saying to other people, could you take my son out for maybe take him to Sheraton, have a walk around Sheraton. He's got some money. He'd like to buy a sandwich at Subway. He'd like to buy some chewing gum. He'd like to do this. He'd like to do that. Those kind of things you would think might be possible. But when it comes down to a frequency, no, it's not. It's not going to happen. So even though we want to give our child autonomy, there are very few situations where we can do that and feel safe about it and look forward to a frequency of event.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
It just doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. The other thing is that I think quite a few of the things you said in your second half of the presentation, where you came up with some basic preliminary implications, you call them. I call them preliminary conclusions, are that many things you said there are not news to parents who have been on this game now for the past 30 years, as I have.
Not at all.
And I can make a list here, and I was ticking them up as you went along. The frustration with the school system, the frustration with the promises about inclusive education, which has been going on now for the past, I don't know, 4 or 5 years. The promises about better social conditions in future, jam tomorrow maybe, but not jam today. The idea of independent living for all sorts of disabled people, as well as mentally challenged people. All of these things are waved as flags somewhere down the road, maybe 5 or 6 years, or 6 years time. A lot of us don't have 5 or 6 years time. We want it now. We want to feel good about what we think of the future is going to be for us, as well as our kid. And these things just don't happen. So even though you've touched upon these things, you've raised the hackles of myself and quite a few other people, I'm sure, in this audience. But nothing actually ever happens. Now, you've just said as well, why aren't they happening? We need to do this. We need to do that. The problem is that I've found over the past 10 years, maybe 15 years now, is that there are very few parents out there who will actually put their shoulders at the wheel, step forward, and really push along with you. There are very few people you have organizations who have very few really strong volunteers, those people who will sacrifice their own time and effort and money as well. They will set aside their professional obligations to push organizations. And at the end of the day, there's very few people actually who actually achieve things. That is a major stumbling block to actually making some progress, not only for the kids who are very young, as well as for the kids who are now mature.
Mhm.
The fact is, I keep on saying to people, look, we have a generation now which has grown up in my last 30 years, which are now in their 30s and 40s. That generation is basically finished. It's the new generation we should be planning for. That's why we made such a hard effort, pushed effort over the past 4 or 5 years to get our building around the corner sorted out, and we finally got there. But I keep on saying to people, it's not for us. It's not for people who are now in their mature years, and their kids are in mature years as well. It's for the parents to realize that if they have small children, it's for them. If they have small kids about 4 or 5 years old and they know they're on the spectrum, well, that building and what that building can offer is for them. But the boomerang comes back again. How many parents out there, how many caregivers are going to step forward and say, yes, we can organize things for our kids. We can organize things for our adults, our teenagers, those with raging hormones. We don't know what to do about them. There's
Right.
very few people who actually do anything about it.
Right, exactly.
I'm very sorry to
That's the
very
issue.
sorry to say that, but very few things have actually struck off in my head what is new. All of these things are very old for me. But
Right.
if you've
They're
ticked
not
off
new.
if you personally have ticked off all these boxes, well, I agree. You've done a very hard, all-inclusive piece of work. But I want to know what it is going to take those parents out there to really step forward and really fill the other side of the problem. There's two sides to this problem. There's the children on the spectrum, and there's the parents who have got children on the spectrum. If the parents don't pull along, then those kids will be confined to a not very bright future in their future. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for your contribution. I think it's really valuable. I actually meant to preface at the beginning of the presentation with the disclaimer, a lot of these things are not new. And a lot of the things that I'm going to be saying are not new, especially, again, because this research has been done by you all. So it's really just a way of taking what you all have been saying forever, right? Everything that's been going on, everything that's been happening, all of your experiences, and turn it into data. Because at the end of the day, what policy officials, what officials want is data, right? They've been screaming that they've been wanting data for the last few years. Well, here we go. So what happens next when something as comprehensive as this project then gets turned into data? It gets turned into evidence. It is no longer just your constituents saying things and complaining, right, and having gripes, but now it's actual peer-reviewed, informed data that can be used by government community organizers and families, right, to then push for the things that are required, the things that are needed and the things that they can push for as per the evidence. And then the other thing that I did want to mention is that I absolutely agree. I try my best to not be a nihilist and to be cynical. I recognize that the CDC has had some improvements. I'm not saying that they're great. They've gone from maybe having a 5 to 7 year wait list to now maybe having a 2-year wait list. Is that objectively improvement? Yes. Is that subjectively improvement? Absolutely not. I wholeheartedly agree. Again, it goes back to the urgency. I don't think that there is urgency. I don't think that there is enough urgency coming from a lot of spaces, right? But particularly the government spaces that are supposed to be, right, responsible for things like development and expansion of the services within the CDC. And then I wanted to then, again, I appreciate, Frank, everything that you said. Absolutely, I 100% value and is important to understand. There's a lot of nuance that's happening that is really important to understand and to really highlight. But with that being said, I did want to give Nadia a chance to say something because she had her hand up for a while. Nadia.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for your presentation, Taylin. Just want to say something quickly. I do agree with Taylin, where when she said that the diagnosis has improved, the ministry has employed more psychologists. I've spoken to the lady that deals with referrals from schools, and they have employed more psychologists. And the wait list to once they get a referral is down to a few weeks. CDC, their psychologists don't have a long wait list either. So the diagnosis is not a problem in Barbados as it was before. They've definitely improved that. But as Taylor said, what happens after? That is the huge gap in what is needed. That's it.
Yeah, thank you for that. And right, and I think that when we put all of our chips into one area, or right, then a lot of things get left behind. And so I think we really need to start understanding how we can approach these different challenges or these different, again, urgent issues across the board instead of just in one specific area and assuming that that's going to be enough and it's going to cut it. It's never going to be enough. It's never going to cut it. We need to understand people from a holistic approach, which again, the government officials have been saying, right? Press releases, news articles, you know, so on and so forth, parliament sessions, whole child approach, one child approach, really understanding. But when it comes to the actual actions that are happening, that's not necessarily the case. Or at the very least, that's not necessarily the case with what they are telling the public or giving us as far as updates and information. And then I know there was a question in the chat. Good evening, everyone. This question doesn't have to be addressed immediately. Based on your personal experience as a person on the spectrum, how was your experience in Barbados? And if you had any challenges with how things are done here, what measures of coping do you use? See, that is an interesting question. I don't necessarily involve myself within these conversations because I'm not from here. But one of the things that I have noticed is that when I do share that I am autistic, explicitly to people here, because I've been calling it, or I've been using the term able passing, meaning that I can walk into society and for the most part, I don't look like I have a disability, I don't act like I have a disability, right? I keep my stimming to myself. I tend to internalize a lot of things. I tend to mask a lot. So I have a lot of like high functioning characteristics. But what comes with that is a feeling of alienation and a feeling of displacement, a feeling of not belonging. What also comes with that is really chronic fatigue because I'm constantly on, right? I'm constantly engaged, I'm clocked in, I'm activated. So that has been a bit difficult. What has also been a bit difficult for me for the last 3 years actually is that I've been trying, I've really tried so hard to find autistic adult spaces to no avail, and it would be nice, it would have been nice, it would be nice to be able to walk into a space where I know that I can be who I am and not have to worry about what others are going to think of me, and not having to worry about what others not only are going to think about me, but how they're going to hold it against me as a professional. Because that is another aspect for me, is that I am a professional. I am an expert in my own right. I have a lot of experience and I have a lot of skills and development training. I am a jack and master of many trades, right? But at the same time, because I may be portrayed as whimsical and young and silly and loose, right? Like really fun and frolicky, then those inherently contradict. I must not be as much of a professional as I might say on paper that I am, right? And so I have to be mindful. I'm constantly having to be mindful about walking through these different spaces as a person with the hats that I wear, and and being autistic and ADHD. So I really appreciate that question. I know I'm not the only one that deals with it. One of the people that I did interview who has autism deals with the same exact stuff. They're from here, born and raised Barbadian, and they deal with the same exact issue. They've gone their whole life mainstreaming. They walk a very similar tightrope. So I have a feeling that that is not necessarily unique to me or unique to that autistic person. I also have had informal conversations with other autistic people who have come out out of the woodwork and just so happen to be there, and they kind of say the same things, including wishing that there were more spaces for us to really get to know each other and have support and solidarity amongst ourselves. Which is why I've been really advocating for those kinds of spaces. But yes, short story long, I hope that answers your question. And then I wanted to see, Nadia, I don't know if you have your hand raised from the last question or if you had another question, but I did want to also just invite any other questions or comments or anything like that, any other feedback from anyone. Yes, Frank?
Yeah, hi again. I think as well, it's worth giving you this comment as well, which is that there's always a terrific time lag, it seems, between having discussions as you have just presented and seeing them have some effect. There seems to be a time lag of several years. I gave an address to parents at the St. Michael's School in 2019. It seems like 100 years ago now. But the address I gave was after the ministry had given a presentation of what they thought would be the future movements in special education needs to a whole group of people on a Sunday night. Quite a few came out, and there were a whole group of very angry parents at the very back of the audience. And I don't know whether anybody else was watching, but I was observing just how angry they were, because essentially the whole evening turned into a talk shop. Now, you've just touched upon this as well. It's all very well to have lots of information and have lots of data, which has been missing in Barbados for this community. It's been missing for about 100 years. When I first started off with the association back in 2005, there was no data at all on the numbers of children who were somewhere on the spectrum. Somewhere, some people thought they definitely were on the spectrum, that the children were on the spectrum. Some thought they may be, but there was no hard information, and it's taken such a long time to get to now, which is what, 20 years later, for the special education needs unit in the ministry to be able to say, yes, we are now getting information together through our primary school and through our preschool and through our regular school teachers, reporting on those students who they thought would probably be somewhere on the spectrum. So it's taken 20 years. Now, God forbid that the comments that you're coming up with, which are, as I said before, which are quite common to all these parents, that it's going to take another 20 years for these things to come around to have some effect.
I hope not.
I hope not too. It's extremely frustrating. And as you said a few moments ago, you found you were continually on, as it were. Well, that's the problem with all caregivers and with parents of children who are on the spectrum. They are continually on duty socially around their professional life as well. 24/7, 365. That's what happens to them. And when you lift your head out of the trench and look over, there's nothing but more trenches. There's nothing but more landscape of being at it all the time.
Yeah.
That's what we do need to be concentrating upon as well. We may be able to find some solutions for our kids in whatever dimension that you come out with, whether it's socially or professionally. But the other item as well is that we all worry about, and you haven't quite touched upon it here. I thought you were going to steer your way to it, but the prospects of not education, the prospects of employment for people on the spectrum as they go into their teens and their young adult years, the prospects of employment is practically zero.
Zero.
Now, I've had it out with quite a few, so many employers about this, that it's not going to affect their bottom line. They're not going to chase customers away. They're not going to lose money. They're not going to be held to account by people who thought that they should sue them because they've been entertained by somebody on the spectrum behind the counter who led them astray and things like that.
Mhm.
That is the terrible challenge for the parents and for the kids as well. We want them to have autonomy. Employers who could give them some kind of autonomy don't give a shit. Pardon me. They don't give a damn. They don't give a damn at all.
Right.
And it's that kind of impact that kind of target you've got to make an impact in as well. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. As I kind of briefly said it not too long ago, I am one person, but also this is the first community update. There will be more. There are when I tell you there are so many things that I have not talked about that are part of this project. So many things. It was really hard to decide what it is that I should, or should not work on. I, interestingly enough, did just submit an abstract to a really large, international conference, specifically on autism and employment. So if you're interested, I can send you the abstract so you kind of have an idea of where the research has been kind of going within that realm of autism and employment, because there are just so many factors in this project, right? There are many things that can be talked about and many things that can be written. Maybe a book, we'll see, who knows?
Well, if I can just reply to that, I know this is an academic exercise for you. For parents, it's a day-to-day nightmare for some people. For other people, it's a day-to-day test of their patience and their ability to last out quite a few years. But I would helpfully try to say that the kind of practical effect that parents want at the end of the day is help in lasting out. We know what the problems are with our kids. What we want to know is how those problems can be sorted out, even for us,
right.
quite selfishly for parents. Parents want to see quite selfishly some kind of out for them.
Right.
They need a break. They need a break.
They need a lot of things. There is so much support that is missing. I mean, one thing I will say, I wasn't born a scholar. I was born autistic and ADHD, right? So I was born the way that I am. I was not born an academic. So yes, this is an academic exercise, but this is also my life. And also just my career forever, right? I want to devote as much of my being into myself and my own healing, as well as into the repair and healing of the communities in which I engage with and find myself identifying with in the Caribbean. But aside from that, there have been plenty of times, like if I can be completely vulnerable and forthright, there are plenty of times where I have engaged with multiple family entities and have walked away just frustrated and crying because I don't know how to help them in this moment with the resources that I have currently right now. But at the very least, what I can do is make sure that their stories don't go unheard. And so, although, again, like you said, this is something that is part of a dissertation, right? It's an academic practice, but it's a lot more than that to me. You know, in the Caribbean, we really pride ourselves in storytelling and oral histories and the passing down of really important information and livelihoods, right, and stories and stuff. So I really hope to engage in that. I am not one to pack up and leave. You're never going to see me again. My intention is to stay here for better, for worse, within the Caribbean, and to continue to also advocate for the things that the ministries are responsible for. And so, you know, but part of that is also understanding that these families are one hair away from catastrophe. And that is not a life worth living. That is not a life that is of thriving. That is pure survival. And if anybody has been dealing with generations of survival in the Caribbean, or just in the world, it's Caribbean folk. That is generationally what we do at a minimum, is surviving. And we really do deserve more opportunities to thrive, and more opportunities of self-care and healing, and of community and camaraderie, where we feel like we can take a breath, we can lower our shoulders and just live in the moment, as opposed to feeling like you know, just another dog in society. Not to go on a whole tangent, I'm sorry about that, but yes, I agree, Frank. I think that it's decades, if not hundreds of years overdue, for more equity within these spaces. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. It has officially been 2 hours. Thank you guys so much for being with me. Thank you to all who are still here. Thank you to all who have really toughed it out for as long as possible. I'm really excited to upload this webinar to YouTube. So once it is uploaded, I will make sure to send it out to everybody who has registered and maybe couldn't attend or had to leave early. And to everybody that stayed, just so you can also share it with others. Knowledge is power, and there are power in numbers. And so when we as a community get together and really understand what is going on as a collective, there really is more of a driving force and for change. And so that is ultimately what is, you know, what the foundation of this research, and the reason why I want to do these community updates and continue involving myself and really showing out for the communities in which made this project possible, right? And have really just opened up their arms and hearts to me. I'm not going to get teary-eyed. Okay, have a good night, everybody. Thank you so much again. Thank you all for those who've commented as well. Have a good night.